everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Historical Society of the New York Courts podcast, where we chat with the authors of Judicial Notice. Today, we're joined by the Honorable Helen Friedman. Judge Friedman is the editor-in-chief of Judicial Notice and a trustee of the Historical Society. She retired about a decade ago after 36 years on the New York State bench. Her broad experience includes 6 years as Associate Justice of the Appellate Division, First Department, more than 8 years as a justice in the Commercial Division, and service as a Supreme Court justice and civil court judge in the past, along with many other accomplishments in a long and distinguished career. We're so glad to have her with us today. Judge Friedman, thanks for joining us.
And thank you for having me.
Of course, and thank you for your work on JN. You've been editor-in-chief there now for, oh gosh,
I
7, 8
think
years?
since 2015. I started with JN 12, I think, yeah.
So we're still going strong, and we're so grateful for that. And so today, I just want to dive right in. I don't think that we need to do a lot of preamble because we've got a lot of material to get through today. But we just, as you said, we're on Judicial Notice 18? 18?
Yes,
19?
this is Judicial Notice 18.
18. And we have a number of tremendous articles, one of which you contributed. And we encourage our listeners to always go to the website, history.nycourts.gov. You'll find Judicial Notice right there. And Judge Friedman, just like all of our other authors, is going to give you a taste of the pieces that they've written. But we really want you to go and read the articles because they're tremendous works. Before we get into the meat of the article, do you want to sort of set the stage for us? Because all of our pieces are writing about different time periods, and you're entering a unique and very sort of important era of New York in US history, really.
It's basically the second half of the 19th century in New York and beyond, but it focuses on New York.
This is post-Civil War, this is Reconstruction.
It's post-Civil War, it's toward tail end of Reconstruction, and the Civil War, though, is still very much on everyone's mind. It's only been over for maybe 11 years. We're talking 1876 when we get to the election. It's a big factor in everyone's thinking.
Yeah. In the Civil, and in this context at that time, I mean, the sense of national unity that one had hoped that would return sort of was shattered after the assassination of Lincoln and sort of the failure of Reconstruction. And so that's sort of the context we're in, right?
Well, that's the context for the election of 1876.
We'll get to.
Of course, my article delves into a lot of what Tilden did before, or how he got to the point of being the Democratic candidate for president.
And so you said the key word here, because you're focused, unlike some of our other pieces, which have a cast of characters, you're very focused on one main player in your article, who's Samuel Tilden. Can you just give us the short elevator pitch of who he is, and then we'll dig into it.
Okay. I became interested in him, as I said, because I had done the legal history of Columbia County, which is where I am, by the way, right now. And I live part-time in Columbia County. I discovered that Samuel Tilden had come from Columbia County. Before that, all I knew about him was that he was defeated for president, even though he was the only one to actually get the majority of the popular vote. Both Gore and Clinton got the plurality, but he got the actual majority.
So this is just what most people will be familiar with Tilden, is just that little line in a text.
That's all people knew. And that's all basically I knew, other than the fact that he must have had some relationship to my alma mater, NYU Law School, because there was something called the Root Tilden Scholarship, which was named after him. That was a prestigious scholarship. And that there was a club, a Democratic club on the East Side, the Tilden Democratic Club, and there was a high school in Brooklyn named after him. When I started to read about his relationship to Columbia County, I got interested. I went to his gravesite, which has a huge gravestone engraved on it. Says, "I still trust the people." And all of that provoked my interest in learning more about him.
For the listener, okay, so there's a big gravestone. There's these things named after him. He's an impactful figure. His biography is, we can dig into it more, but he was the governor of New York. I didn't know that until I mean, I sort of was aware of it, but and he how so can you walk us through who was he and how did he become this
Okay.
figure?
He came from a very modest farm family up here in Columbia County, but he ended up going to NYU sporadically. It's a little unclear as to whether he ever graduated, but he
Mhm.
became a lawyer, hung out a shingle when it had been very involved in politics. He's a very ardent Democrat,
Mhm.
and he and his father were close friends of Martin Van Buren. Van Buren also coming from Columbia County. Once he became a lawyer, he still dabbled in politics, but he only held one actual elected position, and that was from Columbia County. He was a representative in the assembly for just 2 years.
Mhm.
During that time, he actually brokered a deal involving Columbia County and upstate New York, the rent wars,
Yep.
which we've had some articles on before.
Yeah.
Once Stephen Van Rensselaer died, his heirs tried to collect rents from the tenants.
And he was a large property owner.
Van Rensselaer, absolutely. The Hudson Valley at that point was a patroon system
Yep.
almost, and
Yep.
he was a huge landowner. He had a lot of tenants. They were tenant farmers, and they were not enslaved, but about one or two steps above that.
Indentured in a sense.
Indentured to a large extent. Tilden was actually instrumental in converting some of those tenancies into mortgage holdings, and the tenants' rents became mortgage payments for which they ended up owning their property. So
Yeah.
he was involved there, but he did not hold any other office. He
Mhm.
became a very, very successful lawyer and investor. He went from very modest cases, small cases, to becoming the
Mhm.
representative of railroads and coal companies. The two
Yeah.
were very closely related at that time.
Yeah.
And he was very successful, partly because he was very, very smart,
Yeah.
very well read, had a very logical mind, and what he could do was he had a business sense that
Mhm.
affected mergers very successfully. He merged a number of failing railroads into more successful entities, also mergers of coal companies. Ultimately, maybe became subject to the antitrust laws, but this is way before that
Yeah.
time. And he charged modest fees as a lawyer,
Yeah.
but he invested very wisely in his clients and ended up becoming a very wealthy
Very.
lawyer and investor
Yeah.
and advisor.
I was struck in the piece a little bit because I think the charging those modest fees, because you would describe his early practice, he charged like $1 for wills and like 10 or 15 for a court appearance, which, I didn't do the math.
Even back then, that wasn't very much.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But he maintained that sort of approach because I think the sense that I came away from the article was that he was this very strategic person where he said, well, I'll get the business and then I'm going to figure out how to work with these people and leverage and that's both in his business and his political career.
Yeah, it's very interesting that he was able to do that because it would be hard now.
Mm,
Interestingly, both Fisk and Gould, the two big railroad magnates, offered him retainers of $10,000 a year,
mhm.
which was a lot of money back then, and he rejected them. That's
Yep.
not in the article, I don't think. He said, no, I will handle each
Mhm.
case separately. I will charge for each case separately, and
Yep.
I will make the business work. So he was both a lawyer and a businessman at the
And
same
in the
time.
political realm, he rejected a couple of plum positions as well in the sort of patronage world, right?
Yes, he did. He rejected several. One was to be collector of the Port Authority of New York, which was something
Yeah.
of its in one of those kind of jobs that
Yeah.
you got for political reasons. No,
Hmm.
he was not. That's right.
Yeah. And so, I mean, do you have a sense that he was in sort of in this world, in this way, like maintaining his focus on being his kind of own man sort of thing?
being independent, being his own man, and he had a very strong moral sense, which is interesting because he wasn't a great liberal. He was a Democrat at the time. I did not put this in the article, but I will say he did not vote for Lincoln. He voted for Douglas. His biographers assure us that's because he was very concerned about the country breaking up, which of course it did. And then he went on, he even voted for McClellan the second time, which always worried me a little bit. Other than that, he was, as you say, his own man. He was active or involved politically with the Free Soil Party,
Right.
which Martin Van Buren actually ran on that ticket in 1848, of course, didn't win. And he was involved in not extending slavery into the territories, basically. It wasn't an abolition movement, it was a non-extension movement.
Yeah, which sort of builds on the idea of manumission as an alternative, just sort of this tradition that's not abolitionist, but is sort of opposed to the worst.
Well, definitely opposed to extending slavery beyond the states that already had it.
Absolutely. So in that sense of him being his own man, having this moral sense, even though, of course, the times that he was in and our reflection upon them might not be glowing on all of his choices, but he brought this with him into his political career, this sort of sense of independence and reformism and really carving out a space for himself that was contra some of the dominant politics of the time, including those patriotic.
Particularly on the Tammany in New York. And what he became famous for was helping or being very instrumental in breaking up the Tweed ring. As you know, Boss Tweed, William Tweed, who started off as first an assembly member, then state senator, then got on a whole bunch of commissions and boards, which he more or less took over and ran one of the most corrupt businesses in New York City politics. He co-opted members of both parties so that he had no real opposition for a long time. And it ended up costing the city of New York somewhere between 75 and $200 million.
And are those the historical numbers, or are those adjusted for contemporary money?
Those are the historical numbers.
It's a lot more than that.
They couldn't come up with accurate numbers. So those are the estimates, that it was a huge amount. Contractors were charged 3 to 4 times what the cost of the work was, and the overage was distributed among political people in both parties. And unfortunately, the judiciary was wholly involved, which is one of the other things that Tilden is known for. That was starting the New York City Bar Association. He was one of the founders of it with William Evarts, who he with and opposed over the many years. Bar associations weren't well known. This was even before the ABA was founded. It was 1870. And Evarts, Choate, Charles O'Connor, and Samuel Tilden all founded the New York City Bar Association. The earliest mission was to reform the judiciary, and within short order, 4 judges were, and I don't know how it happened, but they were suddenly removed, one of whom was Albert Cardozo, the father of Benjamin Cardozo. And it is ironic because nobody could have been a straighter person than Benjamin Cardozo. His father, however, we don't fortunately hold the sins of the father against the son.
Sometimes you go on to try to redeem the family name
himself. That's true.
And
absolutely, yeah. In fact, Tilden was also famous for nationally for something, the Cooper Union speech. Now, that's funny because the Cooper Union speech is what catapulted Lincoln to national prominence.
It was an important institution.
It helped, yes. It definitely helped Tilden because he railed against the Tweed ring and how corrupt it was and how it was destroying the city of New York.
Yeah.
And ultimately, Tweed was brought to trial. Elihu Root was one of his defense lawyers. Everybody's entitled to a good lawyer. There was a hung jury in the second trial. Tilden was testifying against Tweed. He was convicted. He was imprisoned. He escaped from prison, ended up in Spain. And ironically, Thomas Nast's cartoons of Tweed were instrumental in the police in Spain identifying and catching him and sending him back to jail.
And these are the famous, I mean, if you see a picture, again, we just go back to that 8th grade textbook. These are the cartoons of Tweed that would be put in there by his entry, right?
Yeah. So
very famous images.
His involvement or his success with the Tweed ring is what catapulted him to national prominence. But first he was elected governor in New York in 1874. And then the great election of 1876.
Well, before we get to let's talk about his gubernatorial service briefly, because he did go on to pursue higher office. But tell us a little bit, because this context of fighting the Tweed machine, his independence, all that comes together to some extent in what he was pushing as governor and with a national platform.
Right. Reform of corruption, basically. I don't know how else to put it. Upstate New York was being dominated, or the political scene was being dominated by the canal rings. The canal rings were not so different in their operation from the Tweed rings. Upstate canals were very important. We all know about the Erie Canal, but there were other canals that were working together. And at that point, the Erie Canal was very instrumental in commerce going from New York out west. The canal owners were charging the state of New York 3 to 4 times, is what the estimates of what the cost of repairs and reconditioning was. And everybody was in on it. Everybody was getting the graft, similar to the Tweed ring. And when Tilden got into office, he was just appalled by that. And he worked very hard, both as governor and subsequent over the years with other governors to do that.
Yeah. And I'll just note, even as a canal enthusiast, sometimes we have some defunct, I'm in Onondaga County, and in this region we have people who built their own canals just without any permission, and then tried to charge the state for them.
Oh, okay. So you're knowledgeable about this.
I try. But his national platform was really that reform of corruption, that fighting of it, that sort of early progressive, small, progressive party type things. That was not his movement, but it was in that vein again, right?
Again, but also because of his involvement with mergers and railroads that went out west, he was known out west as well. He wasn't directly political in that he didn't have, other than 2 years as governor of New York and 2 years much earlier as a state assemblyman, he was not involved in electoral politics himself, but he was very supportive of other candidates. And I could name a number, but one who was the governor of New York, Silas Wright, Wright. He was also a very prominent governor and very close to Tilden.
Yeah. And so this sets him up for the meat, and this sets up the piece that you're writing after we kind of go through the biography and we get to 1876. So tell us.
Okay, 1876. First of all, people didn't campaign the way they do now. He did not crisscross the country or anything like that, but he wrote all of the pamphlet. He was unusual in that he put out a lot of pamphlets, which he himself wrote about himself. Pamphlets were, again, this seems so basic to us now, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
People didn't campaign for
No,
presidency.
and people, I mean, many of our listeners will be familiar when we think about the Hamilton musical and we're talking about the differences with Aaron Burr going out and knocking on doors and doing all this campaigning himself, which was regarded as tacky and not the done thing.
And,
This
and
was too desperate, too pandering.
it wasn't even done then. You could make speeches as we know Abraham
Yep.
Lincoln did. He had a kind of high, Tilden's voice was not resonant and wonderful, but that's okay because he wasn't on television or he wasn't,
Yeah.
he wasn't on the radio. So, on a one-on-one speech, he was fine. But again, he didn't go across country much. Neither did Hayes, who was former governor.
Yep.
Quickly, Hayes was the Republican candidate, and you have to remember, 1876 is 11 years after the end of the Civil War. The only only real presidency we had, of course, Andrew Johnson, then 8 years, I'm sorry, of Ulysses Grant, and now the Republican Party was still the party of Lincoln, the party of reform, the Northern Party. So here we are. And Tilden gets the nomination of the Democratic Party, which was the opposition party, the Southern, if you will, the Southern Party, all the states that had come back into the Union one way or another. And were at that point, most of them, or many of them, were already not subjected to the Reconstructionist governors or
The sort of
political
occupation.
figures.
Yeah.
So it was pretty much assumed that Tilden would get the Southern vote, which for the most part he did.
Mhm.
What the big change was New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey, our tri-state area here, all voted for Tilden. There was no question about those votes. Ironically, Colorado had just come into the Union in the end of August of 1876.
Mhm.
Had it not come into the Union, Tilden would have been clearly president. But
Yeah.
Colorado had 4 electoral votes, and they all went to Hayes.
Yeah.
He was basically the New England and the Midwest candidate, and the West to the candidate. Indiana was the other state that went for Tilden. We get the electoral votes in early, and Tilden has 184, no question. You need 185 at that point to win, now that Colorado's been admitted.
Yep.
So we have 19 votes that are contested. There was 1 vote from Oregon that was contested under a strange process for a strange reason, which I'm not going to go into. But other than that, it was South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. Well, mayhem occurred. Everyone was going down to these states, both sides, or representatives of both sides, not the candidates themselves.
Yeah.
There was shenanigans, deals, all kinds of things. But there was something called the returning boards or the canvassing boards. It depends upon which state you're involved with and at what time. And those boards would report back the votes or the electoral votes.
And these bodies still exist today. We're familiar with these from recent years.
Okay. And not only that, in South Carolina, there were 2 returning boards, one for return for Tilden, one for Hayes.
Okay.
In both Florida and Louisiana, the returning boards wholesale threw out, in Louisiana, large parishes of votes on various pretextual reasons, which I'm not going to go into.
Parishes in Louisiana being the equivalent of counties.
Counties. In Florida, had 4 electoral votes. Some votes were thrown out there, but if anything, that was the most controversial because the Supreme Court of Florida said that Tilden had won. There was a lawsuit brought to and the Supreme Court said clearly Tilden has won. And
Mhm.
the governor and the returning boards completely ignored that
Sure.
decision of Florida. So Florida was particularly raw, and that's ironic when you think of Bush v. Gore
Yeah.
a number of years later. However, how do we decide this?
Yeah.
The Constitution has a clear provision. It goes to the House of Representatives.
Mhm.
Each state gets one vote. So
Mhm.
the majority of the members of the House from that state govern.
The
And
text is very clear.
it's easy. The House of Representatives at that point was Democratic. Tilden would have won. The Senate was Republican. The Senate said, we are not going to abide by that decision. We will not go along with that. And ultimately, something called an electoral commission was set up. Both the Senate and the House agreed to the electoral commission. I don't want to go into, it would take me a little while, or
Yeah.
maybe I can take, the House had 5 members, the Senate each had 5 members, and the Supreme Court got 5 members. So there are 15 members
Yeah.
of the commission. It was 3-2 in the Senate and in the House,
Mhm.
3 Republicans in the Senate, 2 Democrats, and vice versa in the House. So that was going to be a wash.
Mhm.
And it all depended on the Supreme Court. There was one Supreme Court justice who was considered truly independent, and he withdrew to run for Senate in Illinois.
Uh-huh.
Even though there were a lot of people who said, please don't do this, you're the one independent. Anyway, Justice Bradley was substituted. Justice Bradley was a Grant appointee, considered to be a Republican. People thought maybe he would be fair. And there's a lot of question about what happened, because there's the claim that Alan Nevins, the historian, a great American historian, put forth, which said that Bradley's vote was in Florida, when it came to Florida, was changed by a group of men who went to his house in the middle of the night. Well, William Rehnquist, who wrote this book on the 1876 election, says that's pure hearsay, that's not admissible. It didn't happen, in effect. And
Mhm.
the commission's vote was completely fair.
Yeah, but Justice Rehnquist had an axe to grind of his own.
Well, I don't want to say that, so you can say
I'll take host privilege.
it. Basically, every single vote was 8-7.
Yeah.
And every single electoral vote was given by 8-7 to Hayes. Hayes, therefore, on March 2nd. Now, in those days, the inauguration was March 4th. Late on March 2nd, the commission delivered its votes for Hayes. Hayes was kind of surprised, to say the least.
Yeah.
And to his credit, Hayes didn't think the Electoral Commission was fair, neither did, or constitutional, and neither did Tilden. But both of them felt this is what the Senate and the House have come up with. We're not going to fight it. When Hayes got the 185 electoral votes on late March 2nd, he had himself sworn in quite secretly on March 3rd because he didn't quite believe it
Just to
himself.
make it official.
Anyway, of course, then they had the regular inauguration on March 4th. Again, he was sworn in. There was a lot of pressure on Tilden to contest the election, and he said, no, the country comes first.
Country of itself.
I think it was unfair. I think I was elected pretty much like, almost like Al Gore. I believe I won. In fact, he said jokingly from time to time, I have the benefit of the knowledge of knowing that I was elected president of the United States, but not the cares or burden posed by it. And Hayes came in under a cloud, and he served one term.
Yeah.
it was awkward for him. And he always felt, I think, a little bit uncomfortable with what happened. But he did serve as president. And Tilden went on. When he going back a little, he ran his campaign pretty much from his wonderful house,
Mhm.
15 Gramercy Park, which is now the National Arts Club. It was a beautiful residence then. He had bought it. Although he was a bachelor, he had his sister was living there, his nephew, a lot of relatives were living there with him, so he was not alone. Although there was a headquarters in downtown New York for his campaign, he kind of ran it out of his house, 15 Gramercy Park. After his defeat, he tried hard to influence subsequent governors, particularly with respect to the canal rings. He was also very strong on what we call hard specie,
Mhm.
hard money, as opposed to the greenbacks that had been basically created or to pay back the Civil War debts, which were huge, and particularly to the farmers. He and Hayes did not disagree on those things. The House went along with with the commission, partly because Hayes promised to end Reconstruction, which he did. Tilden probably would have too. So there's no saying that Tilden would have been a great president. We just don't know.
But there would have been a few policy differences that we would expect, at least at the beginning of those administrations, and it was much more about control of having your guy in the White House rather than the other person's guy.
Right. No, that's definitely the case. He lived till 1886.
Yep.
So it wasn't that long, about 12 years. They tried to nominate him, or his people tried to nominate him the next two times.
Mhm.
1880, he wanted to be anointed. He didn't want to go after it. Well, he didn't get anointed. And in 1884, he was just too sick by then. Based on the medical knowledge I have now and the description of the ailments that he was suffering from by his biographers, I think he had Parkinson's disease or something similar to that by then, and he died in 1886. He was 72 years old. Not
And so
old
there's
by
some
today's standards, but
well, but old by the standard. So after he passes away, there's a sort of final chapter here,
there is.
his will. Because he had money. What did he do with it?
His estate was valued when he died, was valued because so much of it was in stocks. The valuation wasn't clear, but there were various valuations anywhere from $6 to $10 million. Now, that may not seem like so much now, but that was a huge amount
Yeah.
in 1886. He was a bachelor. In fact, do we have time? One of his
Close friends.
close friends, Bigelow, writes about all the women who tried to tell nieces, daughters, themselves what wonderful wives they would be, and would he please consider their applications or their letters.
Just quite a catch, if nothing for the money.
His money. Oh my God. It would have been a nice old age for any of those women. And many of them were way younger than he was. But in any event, he resisted all that. And he left his money, various requests, one to Columbia County Library. He had moved by the way, he had bought a huge farm in Yonkers. He established a library there. So another bequest went to the library there. He was very big on libraries.
Yeah.
And he had 20,000 books in his house in Greystone, Yonkers, which is where he moved to after he sold his house at Gramercy Park. His will provided for the establishment of a trust. The trustees are urged to fund a library for the state of New York, but they can do what they want with the money. That's what he really wanted. It was vague, but under charitable trust law, it probably passed muster. And Bigelow, his very close friend and biographer, was the main trustee, and then there were four other trustees named to manage this will. Well, after the individual bequests were taken care of in the will, there were a good $5 or $6 million left.
Yeah.
The heirs, or should we say the creditors of a number of his heirs, and the heirs, all collateral heirs, because he didn't have any children, contested the will successfully. Again, the trial judge found the will was fine. The appellate court, and it wasn't quite an appellate division at that point, it was an appellate court,
Yeah.
by 3-2, reversed the trial court, and the Court of Appeals by 4-3 agreed with the appellate court. So by one vote, he lost again, or after death, he lost. And so, however, his grandniece, who was the recipient of the biggest chunk of the will as heir, took her $3.5 million or whatever it was, and said, "I'll take a." And this was actually while the will was under contest. She said, "If you give me $1 million, I'll give the trust $2.25 million or $2.5 million." And so the trust got that money, and Bigelow, being resourceful, and the main trustee, went to the Astor and
two other trusts.
two other trusts. One, the Astor Trust, and I'm just
I don't remember the other.
And said, "Look, your libraries aren't doing anything. Why don't we work together and see if we can create the New York Public Library," which is what Tilden really wanted.
Yeah.
That's what they did. If you go into the library now, New York Public Library, between the lions, the very majestic stairway, there's a full-length picture of Samuel Jones Tilden, acknowledging that it was his will that basically was responsible for setting up the library. Lenox, it was the Astor and Lenox, it just came to me, libraries.
Yep.
And if you look also, you'll see that it is founded by the trusts of the Astor, Tilden, and Lenox, the library is founded by those three trusts.
And so anyone who's ever set foot in the New York Public Library or who avails themselves of their services is still benefiting from Tilden's legacy.
Absolutely. Not only that beautiful library, but all the branches that came. Now, I am sure a library would have been established at some point, but it took a while. It was 1905, I think, before the library was actually opened, or 1911 before it really started to admit people. First of all, they had to get funding to build the building. The city provided that and provided the land, and it was the trust that provided for the building, and the 20,000 volumes that Tilden had collected, together with all of the volumes in the Astor and Lenox libraries, provided the first books that went into that library. A bit of my research was a book by Alexander Flick, his other biographer, which is in such bad condition that I couldn't take it out from the library. So I spent all my time reading it in that library and enjoyed being in it very much.
It's a beautiful space to do that kind of work in.
It was.
So, Will, you've told us the story of this really interesting and impressive man and this election. I have two final questions, because as you alluded to, and you didn't allude to, you said it earlier, the text of the Constitution is very clear about what happens in the case of someone not achieving the electoral count. Was the commission, I mean, they accepted it, but was it constitutional?
I certainly don't think so. And Roy Morris's book, which is called The Fraud of the Century, really, I think, was an accurate description of what happened. There's no question to me that, at least in my mind, that this should have gone to the House of Representatives. And clearly, because the House of Representatives was Democratic at that point, and even state by state was Democratic, Tilden would have been elected. So everything, it seems to me, was wrong. And that's why I wondered about Rehnquist's taking the position he did, but he was Chief Judge of the Supreme Court of the United States, and I'm just a New York State former judge, so who knows?
Well, I'll again, I made my position on Rehnquist's book clear earlier, so we'll do that. But because I mean Rehnquist is writing in the context of Bush v. Gore and the decision there, and we do continue.
Justifying it, yeah, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah, I think it. I mean, when I read it ages ago, I thought it was his mea culpa in some ways, but not even a mea culpa, just a no mea. I don't know. Anyway, but the other question that I've got for you is, and we ask all of our authors this for the piece. What resonance does this have for today? Do you see anything that's really illustrative or important?
Well, yes, first of all, the decision on the part both of Tilden and, to be fair, Hayes, and just parenthetically, Tilden was not a lovable human being, from what I understand. He was kind of a little bit nerdy, but also a bit rigid, personally rigid. So that, whereas Hayes was a folksier fellow. And there was another factor that Hayes had been not a Civil War hero, but he was been a colonel, I think, in the Army. Tilden, when the war broke out, was 48 years old, 47 or 48 years old. So not only did he not serve, he was not the type to go volunteering at an older age or anything like that, although he was, supported the Union all the
Yeah.
way. What resonates now is that even then there were people who were ready to put the good of the country above their own political aspirations. And I see less and less of that now. And I also feel that the statesmanship that we saw both by Tilden and by people around him is something I wish we could see more of today. Issues that the country's facing, while they were very serious back then, they're even more serious now. And I would hope and pray that people rise above some of the stuff that we're seeing nationally now. Look, there was a lot of prejudice then. We've come a long way in terms of prejudice. While Hayes was not a bad man, he was accepted the know-nothing, very anti-Catholic views that were prevalent at that time. We don't do that now directly, but unfortunately, it's still surfacing. And I'm just hoping that the good of the country is what ends up happening now for the sake of my children, my grandchildren, your children, your grandchildren, and everybody's children, because this is a great country and we have to keep it great.
A republic if we can keep it, and we can.
Republic if we can keep it. No, that's very good. Benjamin Franklin's words still resonate 200, almost 50 years after.
We're coming up on that 250. Wow.
Yeah, it's getting close.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Judge Friedman. This was a tremendous conversation. As always, for our listeners, we encourage you go to history.nycourts.gov. You can read this issue and many of the issues that Judge Friedman has steered to completion and continues to, and we're so grateful for that work. So we thank you, and this has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Eric, and
Thank
we'll
you.
be in touch.